Nick and I are, we're going to, it's this late in the afternoon and you've all been drinking wine and as I say sometimes, your brain gets full and, you're kind of thinking, well, can I sit out one more session? And so I think Deborah figured it took both of us to keep you entertained and hopefully bring some information to you. But it's a real pleasure to work with Nick on this. Actually, I just have to tell you, it's a real pleasure to actually see Nick. And it's not that I had any doubt that he was going to be here, but while we were working on this concept and this presentation and trying to organize the wines and what we're going to say this afternoon, I think this last week is the only time that we've both been in the same hemisphere. And you just have to love email and, the ability to send PowerPoint slides back and forth. And so it's really great to be here with Nick. It's a real honor as well. I've known Nick for a very long time and have a lot of respect for. He's a great winemaker, but he's got more energy than anybody I've ever seen. So it's great to do that. We're going to kind of make this up as we go because we haven't really rehearsed it at all. So I think what we'll do is I'll do a little bit and then turn it over to Nick. So since I work a lot in South Africa, the idea was I'll talk about South Africa a little bit, and then I'll give the rest of the world to Nick, and he can talk about the rest of the world. But that's okay with his. He's got the energy to do that. What we're going to try to do today is cover five regions and 5 wines, and those are the wines that are poured in front of you. I think that today. You've heard so much about the technical details of clonal variations and site-specific wine growing and so forth. And I'm thinking we're not going to go into quite that amount of detail, but I'm just saying this for myself. I think what we're really talking about here today, and my personal sort of focus is that what we're really talking about is style expression here. And I have a word that I really have a lot of struggle with in the wine industry, and that's the word quality, because it doesn't really mean a lot. Well, it means a lot, but it means different things to different people. So what I'm really excited about is looking at the style expression on these wines this afternoon, and then we'll try to give you some idea of why we think those styles, the styles are different. And so you have the list in front of you. And you've seen today, several of the speakers have talked about the details of different areas as far as the number of hectares and number of tons or liters produced and so forth. So we've already covered this, and we're not going to attempt to go through this in a huge amount of detail. But it is important that you start to get a concept, I think, of where California fits in this whole thing. And the fact that Sauvignon Blanc also I think it's unique as a premium wine variety because you can actually perform very well as far as wine style expression at fairly high yields. And that's not always the case in all varieties in all areas. So I think there's a real positive there. So let me just make a couple of comments. We're gonna take a trip via Google. I always like to show this, talking about South Africa, I always like to show this kind of an approach to boring down because you say South Africa and you can see a lot of people scratch their head. I knew we were really in trouble. This is not meant to be as a political comment, but it's just an observation. George Bush II actually thought Nigeria was an island somewhere off in the middle of the sea someplace. So it turns out that it's not all that unique, that people really don't know much about where the country of South Africa is. So very down at the very southern tip, and I like to have this emphasis, and I think Mike did the same thing today. He talked about where the Antarctic was relative to New Zealand. So it's 2,500 miles of open ocean. A lot of good fishing there, but it's a long way. The real point about where I wanted to show that previous slide and getting to the wine growing aspect of what about South Africa is I just want to point out to you here, and I love this slide because, and let me just tell you what it's saying, is on the right-hand side, there's a vertical axis here with both centigrade and Fahrenheit temperatures on it. And that's color-coded to the sea temperatures along both the eastern coast of South Africa, down around the tip, the Cape of Good Hope, where Cape Town is located. And then you see, as you come up the west coast of South Africa, there are these blue arrows that are kind of pointing up. Well, you know, in that previous slide, I said 2,500 miles here. I don't know if the 2,500 shows up all that well where you're sitting, but 2,500 miles. But the important point is that this blue here is a cold upwelling. It's called the Benguela Current that comes up from the Antarctic. And it really has a dramatic effect on the climate, and particularly the wine-growing climate of South Africa. Most of the grapes in the Sauvignon Blanc is grown, particularly in the cooler areas, which would be Cape Town, out towards, this doesn't show Stellenbosch, but it's out kind of where the pointer is there, and then down to the south of Cape Town, where there is a very, very cool confluence of the two seas. And then also further up the coast on the west coast, which are both mostly dryland farms. And, we talk about head-trained vines. South Africans talk about bush vines. Their bush vines are actually trained very, very low in these areas because it's also a high wind area. And so they kind of get them out of the wind. And those poor vines, they really struggle, and they're basically non-irrigated. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of where we are, some of the sea temperature influences that are going to influence the temperatures there. I threw in just for point of reference, and again, I'm not sure how this is showing up in where you're sitting. It looks a little faded out, but this is what's called the Siemensberg Mountain, and this is just to the north of Stellenbosch, the city of Stellenbosch. And I call Stellenbosch oftentimes, Stellenbosch is sort of the equivalent of UC Davis and the heart of Napa Valley put together. So Stellenbosch is the premium wine growing region as it's viewed in South Africa. And Stellenbosch has the university, the wine and grape research and teaching centers. And so Stellenbosch would be kind of back out of the plain, coming somewhat to me and off to your right. And but this is a fairly typical, and we're going to taste a wine that's from this vineyard area right up in here, and it's called Warwick Estate, and that wine is grown from non-irrigated Sauvignon Blanc. Elevation's about 1,000 feet. And one of the choices why people do that is because of the influence of slightly cooler up there. Mm-hmm. And if I were to put the Cape Town and probably Cape Town itself specifically, Stellenbosch is a little bit further interior. It didn't show that well on the map, but if you were standing in Stellenbosch and you went directly south, a little less than 20 miles, you'd be in the Indian Ocean. If you were standing in Stellenbosch and instead you went to the west about 20 miles, you'd be in the Indian Ocean. I'm sorry, the Atlantic Ocean on the west coast, and that's where the cool upwelling comes from. But still late in the season, and it can be warm there. But the closest climatic comparison to another place that you all know is probably something like Santa Barbara or along the coastal region south of us in California. This is just another view of how the area looks, and. Excuse me. So it gives you a sense that people are also pretty they're pretty focused on the presentation of the vineyards and trying to work in, and I think South Africa is a leader in some of the sustainable wine growing projects that have been done. They don't get a lot of press about it here in the United States, but they started a program they called integrated wine growing. And they have set aside, and again, I don't know how well it shows, but you can see vineyards here, and this isn't particularly one that we're going to taste today, but I just wanted to show it because you have vineyards, and there are lots of native forests scattered around. And these integrated wine growing and these biodynamic and biological wine growing systems, they're really giving the growers a lot of credit for setting aside native lands and trying to preserve the natural landscape. But if you look at these really closely, you'll find that they're somewhat engineered. There have been a lot of invasion, and this is what the South Africans call alien species that have come in. And eucalyptus is one of them, or blue gum. And so the growers actually go out and they cut those trees down and they let the native flora come back. And so there's not a lot of incentive for people to do it from a financial standpoint, but there's a really strong commitment to moving forward with that. So I think today probably the message I'd like to send about the little bit of discussion about South Africa here is, we've heard today about site specificity, especially temperature, water holding capacity, vegetative growth, how big the vines get, and then the impact that comes, particularly in a variety like Sauvignon Blanc, on the imparting aromatic and flavor components. Now, I just want to take one quick second to maybe slightly disagree with one of the tenets that's been out here today, and I too used to believe that in the projects that I work on that a Sauvignon Blanc was unique in that the wines benefited from having a very diverse population of ripeness in the vineyard. And I say that in the past tense. I've now come to believe that I'd rather work with vineyards, my own personal opinion, I'd rather work with vineyards that are quite well known with respect to and managed toward individual aromatic and flavor constituents, and then use different vineyards to blend together to make the wine style that we're looking for. Now, I think that's probably a little bit in difference to some of the other opinions that are put out here today. But anyway, that's sort of my concept, and that may, in a sense, be very reductionist. That is, get the units correct and then put the units together in the right blending. So you can take it or leave it for whatever that's worth. I think what you'll also see as a theme here today over the entire day is you're seeing Sauvignon Blanc without much or any wood influence. Nobody's talking about malolactic. Usually, if anything, in some of these cooler areas, we're trying to get the acid levels down. And you'll note also, and there's a little package, there's a little set stapled together of some tech sheets on these individual 5 wines that's in your package today. And you'll note that the theme is they're at or around or maybe slightly above 13% alcohol. So there's really that sense that these are food wines that are to be enjoyed, and not necessarily with full meals, though they go quite nicely with full meals. But they can also be consumed as an aperitif or with snacks before or after or during a meal. So I want to leave with you this particular reference. And there was a project in South Africa where back when everybody had more research funding than they do now, there's a fellow at the research station based in Stellenbosch, Johan Marais, and the industry went to him and they basically said, we need to understand this variety Sauvignon Blanc. And so they engaged him and supported him very, very strongly. And and he worked on this, he worked on Sauvignon Blanc character and expression all the way into the vineyards, through the winemaking process, reductive or oxidative, cold or warm. It's really rare that you can find one person who could work across so many aspects of a completely integrated issue like working on a variety like Sauvignon Blanc. Anyway, this is a very interesting, it's the South African Journal of Enology and Viticulture, And it's a rather older paper, but in it he talks about some of the attributes that they're looking for and investigating. And it's a really good read. If you it's a really good read. It'll never become a movie, but it's a good read. And I'm not going to spend much time on this. I just had put this in here, and I think maybe it's too late in the day for graphs. But what I'm showing here is South Africa temperature and rainfall versus Napa, just as a comparison, just so you see. And this is in temperatures. This is in centigrade here. And for those who aren't facile with those conversions, that you can imagine 25, 26 here is something like 78 degrees. If you're down here at 15 degrees, and you notice I'm pointing strongly at what would be February and March, and that's not a mistake. That's actually when we're harvesting grapes there. So you can see that in the last part of the season, sort of this November, December, the temperatures are coming up, both the nighttime lows and the daytime highs. There's a small amount of rainfall that occurs. As you look at Napa, with September here, plus minus a little bit, there's essentially no rainfall. And quite honestly, as grape growers in the North Coast or in California in general, basically you're spoiled. If we get a little bit of rain, everybody panics. In South Africa, get a little bit of rain, everybody goes, yeah, let's go have a beer. Figuring that everything will be just fine, and it's part of the character expression. And I don't mean that to be, haranguing on you about being spoiled. It's not bad to be spoiled, but it's sometimes good to know that you're spoiled, because we, other than the 2009 vintage, which nobody really felt particularly privileged about going through that one with the rain we had in October. But in general, we have conditions pretty good here. We tend not to have things like downy mildew here, and Nick can talk about that in other parts of the world. But that's really no fun when, I've seen people lose an entire crop in 48 hours. It's just gone. It gets in the flower cluster during flowering and bang, it's gone. So if anybody ever says, anyway, you don't have downy mildew. So the point was here, nighttime temperatures are warm, so 15 degrees would be like 60, and we're accustomed oftentimes in coastal California to having those temperatures down lower to towards 50 at night. So that would be 10 degrees out here in Napa, and that would be around 50. So a larger diurnal swing in Napa for Sauvignon Blanc. Napa Valley from daytime lows to highs. Not quite as great. The scales are a little bit different here, so it looks a little different, and more rainfall. And you can see that the rainfall is scattered throughout the year, principally a winter rainfall area, but also in the spring and summer and right into the harvest time. Okay. So that's South Africa. I'd be glad to take questions on that later, but Nick's agreed to talk about the rest of the world.
But Phil, a question to you would be, if we remove leaves early or late, how much influence do you think we can have on malic acid with Sauvignon Blanc?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't know. No, I think it's a matter of how you do it. What we know, all of my experience with Sauvignon Blanc, and it's not nearly the breadth of different regions that Nick worked with. But basically what I've come to understand is we don't want to put direct sunlight onto Sauvignon Blanc fruit. But what I like to do, if the canopy is a little bit dense, we do what I call a window. So we go above the fruit zone and take off about 4 to 5 leaves vertically on the shoots, so that the sunlight gets into that canopy. And there's a misconception that for California, for people who want to get away from the pyrazine characters but still keep these vibrant sort of what we call typical or classic Sauvignon characters, there's somehow or another, and this experiment we did a long time ago, back with Mark Cleaver, is there's a difference between sunlight penetration into a canopy and keeping all the leaves functional, as opposed to putting a lot of sunlight on the fruit itself. And yes, you can diminish if you want to get the pyrazine attribute of kind of green bean character out of Sauvignon Blanc, you can do that with direct sunlight onto the fruit. You stand the chance to basically drive up your phenolic content as seen by coloration in the skins of the fruit. You tend to do that very asymmetrically. One side will get more than the other on the canopy and more sunlight. So the trick is to prevent any leaves in the area above the fruit zone. If you have any leaves that start to turn the faintest bit of yellow inside that canopy, that is, the canopy's too dense, then basically you're dumping pyrazines into the fruit. On the flip side, the positive side, if you keep that area open, and the idea is it's very sensitive, it's what I call a dose effect. The longer you can keep sunlight uniformly in that canopy above the fruit zone, and very, very light amounts of filtered sunlight down into the fruit zone, you can get the positive parts of Sauvignon Blanc that we like and skip the green bean, the canned green bean character. And it's just putting, I'm not a big fan of leaf removal machines the way people have typically used them in California, is because they misunderstand the effect, I think. They go down and they sock it against the fruit zone, and you go down and you damage fruit and overexpose and underexpose all at the same time. But if you put that leaf removal machine up above the fruit zone and do that window, and you only have to do it on one side of the canopy, just so none of the leaves inside turn yellow due to being shaded, then you can get the positive aspects of what we're looking for without the flip side negative. So yeah, that was my opportunity to get on a soapbox about something a little bit more than maybe the question, but there you go.
Phil, I got another question for you while I've got you. Free consulting help. So our big... Am I allowed one more question? Mm-hmm. The boss is up here. The big conversations that we have, I don't know about you guys, the big conversations that we have is always about tipping or trimming. And in an area like the Awatiri, where we typically have more of the green bean character, there's a discussion about when we should be tipping, because we obviously have to do that because it's a more vigorous and it's a cooler site. But then of course we've got to deal with the laterals. So would you be a proponent of trying to tip in a non-vegetative cycle and removing the laterals and then letting it go after that, or would you rather wait and trim it later and still allow some of that light penetration going on to the clusters earlier on? Where would you fall into that vigorous vineyard?
Like the first thing is that if you have to trim a vineyard, it probably says that either you get the possibility you get a lot of rainfall or your spacing isn't correct. So first thing is you just pull out alternate vines down the length of the row and extend it so that the vines, so you can dump the hedger, into the deepest ravine you can find and just cover it over. The other alternative is if you can wait, in some particular method, if you can wait until you get about probably 8 to 9 bars leaf water potential. It doesn't have to be stem water potential. If you get 8 or 9 bars of leaf water potential in the vineyard, you can probably trim that vineyard without stimulating a lot of lateral and side shoot growth. So you can get the best of both worlds.